All right, so sulfur cycle mainly circulates as, anybody know what that compound is? Sulfate, good job. I do want you to know that the sulfur cycle mainly circulates as sulfate. I will tell you, I'm going to tell you this first, and then I'm going to go back to that slide. That sulfate actually will travel, I'm jumping right here, just for communication. Sulfate can be in the soil, and we know that my 8s are in the soil, right? But it could be also in the atmosphere, and it could be in the hydrosphere, and it could be in the biosphere. It could enter plants, because we know my 8s enter plants. So I could add bio here too, okay? So how do I survive the difference? If I was you, I would always choose sulfates as my compound in the soil. And if you want to reference atmospheric sulfur, you can call it sulfur oxides, which is SOX. And that's how you could reference atmospheric sulfur and differentiate. And you will get it right. In environmental science, you do not necessarily have to balance compounds or explain chemical formulas for compounds. You could just name them. So sulfur oxides will represent any form of atmospheric sulfur. And the reason I tell you this is because even though you have to know the cycle mainly circulates as sulfates, because sulfates are found in all parts of the cycle, that's important to know. But if you want to differentiate between sulfur in the soil and sulfur in the atmosphere, you can call it sulfur oxides, okay? Because eventually it'll start to get confusing. All right, so it's mainly found, and remember, my little pictures will tell you everything, in the geosphere. But one thing you have to know, and I said this in my period A, I'm standing in the center of the room right here, is that sulfur is a high concentration of coal. So later, when we talk about coal again, you're going to know that the composition of coal is primarily sulfur, okay? That's why when we took coal out of the ground and we started to burn it, we ended up with excess sulfur, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, all of these oxides in our atmosphere because we burned coal that used to be sequestered in the ground. So, how does it get from the soil through the layers of earth? How does it get from the soil through the layers of earth? If sulfate is in the soil, what happens to it? Thank you. Plants absorb it. I know I said eaten. Plants don't really eat, right? So I say it that way so you could start to remember it. But yes, you should know that all the 8s, sulfate, nitrate, get absorbed by plants, and phosphate, okay? And then once the plant eats it, the food chain begins, which means it's going to go from a plant to an animal to another animal. And then what happens? This should be already like with your eyes closed. Thank you. It dies or it gets excreted. And then with your eyes closed. If my little bunny died, what happens to it? Decomposers are going to break the sulfur in the bunny or the nitrates in the bunny or the phosphates in the bunny, right? Or the nitrogen-rich organic compounds, whatever, back into the cycle. That's the way it works. How does sulfate or sulfur oxides, if we want to say, because it could be SO4 or SO2, how does it get into the atmosphere? The pictures are worth 1,000 words. How does it get to the air? So it's not evaporation because the only thing that can evaporate is water. But water will release sulfates. What else does water release automatically into the atmosphere? Test question also. Yes, carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide, okay? How else do sulfur oxides get into the atmosphere? Trees burning. We call that burning of organic matter. What else? Volcanic eruptions. Whoops. And I spelled that wrong, I know. Just fix it. Decomposition, as we mentioned here. And what's the last one? What are we burning here? Fossil fuels. FF is fossil fuels. Or BFF is burning of fossil fuels. All right, so the cycles, according to the law of matter, matter can't be created or destroyed, only transformed. Matter cycles through all layers of Earth, okay? Or most layers of Earth. But because of humans, we have impacted the cycle by either abusing of resources or adding, which is still an abuse of resource, excess matter into the cycle. So I'm going to talk about those as an introductory. You do not have to know the process behind what is happening. You just have to know this equals this, as it says on the slide. So don't start writing things that you don't know. Okay? I'm going to keep talking about that. So we overconsume water. So water shortages are a result of overconsumption. What else can cause water shortages? That's true. But that's natural. Humans, and it's not natural either. We have excess droughts due to global warming or climate change, but that's a whole other story. But what do? Irrigate. But why would irrigation lead to water shortages when water's supposed to cycle? What do you see happening to water in this picture? It's getting shot up. And what happens to water that's going up? It evaporates. The irrigation systems are inefficiently using water. So instead of targeting the crops, the water travels up. Now, do you have to be able to explain that on the test? No, I'm just showing you a picture. You have to know on the test that we waste water or we overconsume water, and that leads to water shortages. That is it. That's all the slide says. That's all you have to know. Later, when we talk about, sadly, how to farm and how irrigation systems work, then you'll have to know what I just explained, okay? Now, what produces excess carbon dioxide into the atmosphere? Burning fossil fuels. We already learned that, Unit 1. We also learned that if we burn fossil fuels and we release excess carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, what results? Global warming. So we already knew that too. When I tell you we review everything 4 and 5 times, we review everything 4 and 5 times. Now, what you haven't learned yet is that excess carbon dioxide also does this. But I'm going to ask you, and I'm moving to the center of the room, what is carbon dioxide supposed to do when it enters water? There's 3 possible answers. It gets dissolved in water, and where does it go? 3 possible answers. What? It can go back into the atmosphere. It can literally go in and out of the ocean. That's one. It can react with calcium, form calcium carbonate, which forms bones and shells and eventually limestone. 2. What's the third thing it could do? At least you're trying. What does carbon dioxide do that helps you live? It can go into a plant in the ocean and go through photosynthesis. Okay? But because we put so much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere when we burn fossil fuels, instead of doing those things, it reacts with water and causes ocean acidification. All you have to know on the test is excess CO2 leads to ocean acidification, which does what to the pH of water? Lowers it. What does limestone do to the pH of water? Raises it. Limestone is a base. So naturally, the limestone should be neutralizing the pH of water, and instead we have ocean acidification occurring, and later we'll learn how it happens and what the consequence is to that as well. Okay? Now, what compound do you recognize here? Sulfur. You could scratch out the nitrogen because we haven't even talked about that. Okay? Sulfur oxides are in excess because we do what? I stood in the center of the room today and I told you. What has a lot of sulfur? Coal. Backwards. Because coal releases sulfur and causes acid rain, which means coal is slightly acidic. Okay? When coal touches water, it's sulfuric acid. Because coal is primarily sulfur. And sulfur plus water is sulfuric acid. Do you have to know that now? No. You have to know that burning fossil fuels releases sulfur oxides, which leads to acid rain. That's it. So when I tell you, list one problem associated, or describe a problem associated with the sulfur cycle, or how have you humans impacted the sulfur cycle, you're going to say, we burn coal, which has a lot of sulfur, and it causes acid rain. That's it. What's a solution? Burning less coal, how? So eventually, change the form of electricity production. That eventually we'll get there. All right, the last thing is this. Anybody recognize this location? No? Key Biscayne. Key Biscayne, okay? And does anybody know how algae blooms form? Has anybody ever heard of an algae bloom? Nobody? You've heard of it? I'm sure you've seen it too. So because this is a cloud and this is a rock, what could these answers be? What's my cloud sink? What? Nitrogen gas, but it's not nitrogen gas, it's nitrates because we're down at the bottom. And what are my rocks? Sulfates is one, and what's the other one? Phosphates. Nitrates and phosphates are actually fertilizer. So there's a lot of them in the ground, and they cause these algae blooms, which again, we'll learn about later. All you have to know is that they're there. And we're done.